January 17, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. Snow falls in silence across the Ardennes forest. The air is sharp, metallic, biting through wool and leather. In the shattered town of Bastogne, American paratroopers huddle in frozen foxholes carved from earth that refuses the shovel. Their breath rises like ghosts. Around them, the trees stand skeletal, stripped bare by artillery. The ground is iron. The sky is white. And somewhere beyond the tree line, engines rumble. German tanks, German voices, German guns forming a noose that tightens with each passing hour. The men of the 101st Airborne Division are surrounded. They are outnumbered. They are running out of ammunition, medicine, and food. And yet, in the face of annihilation, they do not break. They do not retreat. They hold. But to understand why this moment becomes legend, we must step back. Not just weeks, but years. We must return to a belief, a doctrine, a certainty held deep within the Wehrmacht's understanding of war and the enemy they believed they knew. For in the years before Bastogne, German soldiers, officers, and strategists had constructed an image of the American fighting man. It was an image shaped by prejudice, propaganda, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what freedom forges in the hearts of men. They believed Americans were soft, wealthy, undisciplined. A nation of factory workers and jazz musicians, of men who had never known true hardship, who valued comfort over sacrifice. The German soldier, tempered by Prussian discipline and the furnace of the Eastern Front, saw himself as superior, harder, more dedicated, more willing to die for the fatherland. This was not mere arrogance. It was doctrine. It was taught. And it was believed. In 1942, when American forces first engaged German troops in North Africa, the early encounters seemed to confirm these assumptions. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, untested American units were routed by Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. German after-action reports described the Americans as brave but poorly led, their equipment impressive but their tactics clumsy. Officers in Berlin read these reports and nodded. The Americans had industrial might, yes. They could build tanks and planes in staggering numbers, but they lacked the warrior spirit. They lacked the willingness to endure. One German general remarked to his staff, "They fight like men who believe they can go home when it gets difficult." And, in a sense, he was right to wonder. For the American soldier did not fight for empire or ideology in the way the German soldier believed he did. The American fought for something else, something the Wehrmacht could not measure, could not quantify, and therefore could not understand. By 1944, the calculus had begun to shift. Normandy, the bocage hedgerows of France, the brutal grinding advance through Carentan, Saint-Lô, the Falaise Gap. German soldiers who survived these battles wrote letters home that spoke of a different kind of enemy. They described American firepower, endless artillery, air support that arrived like thunder, a logistics network that seemed to conjure supplies from thin air. But even then, the core belief persisted. American soldiers, they reasoned, prevailed through machinery, not spirit, through wealth, not will. The propaganda posters in German barracks still depicted the GI as a gum-chewing simpleton, a puppet of Jewish financiers, a soft boy playing at war. And when the order came in December 1944 for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last great German offensive in the West, this belief became a weapon. Hitler himself declared that the Americans would crack under pressure. "They are not a warrior race," he told his generals. "Strike them hard, strike them fast, and they will collapse." The plan was audacious. 25 divisions, including elite panzer and SS units, would surge through the Ardennes forest, splitting the Allied line and driving northwest to Antwerp. The offensive would encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, force a negotiated peace in the West, and free Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviets in the East. The Ardennes had been chosen because it was lightly defended. The Americans considered it a quiet sector, a place to rest battered divisions and blood-green ones. The forest was dense, the roads narrow, the weather predicted to be poor grounding Allied air superiority. Everything depended on speed, and everything depended on the Americans breaking. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the storm broke. Over 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 85-mile front. Entire American regiments were shattered in the first hours. Confusion reigned. Communication lines were cut. In the fog and snow, German panzer columns poured through the gaps, their tracks chewing frozen mud, their commanders shouting, "Nach Antwerp! Nach Antwerp!" The element of surprise was total. The American line buckled. Units retreated, dissolved, scattered into the forests. And yet, even in chaos, something unexpected occurred. Isolated groups of American soldiers, engineers, artillerymen, rear echelon clerks picked up rifles and held crossroads, delaying the German advance for hours, sometimes a full day, before being overrun or forced to surrender. These were not elite troops. They were not paratroopers or rangers. They were ordinary men doing something the Germans had not anticipated. They were fighting. In the center of the German thrust lay a small Belgian market town called Bastogne. Before the war, it had been a place of no particular importance. Crossroads for farmers bringing vegetables to market, a church, a square, a few cafes. But now, in the logic of mechanized warfare, Bastogne became everything. 7 roads converged there, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Whichever side controlled, Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. The German planners knew this. They had allocated forces to seize it quickly and move on. What they had not planned for was the 101st Airborne Division. The 101st had been resting in Reims, France, recovering from the brutal fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They were understrength, missing equipment, exhausted. Many of the men were replacements, new to the division, some with only weeks of training. On the night of December 17, they received orders to move immediately to Belgium. There was no time to gather full winter gear, no time to requisition proper ammunition loads. They were loaded onto trucks in the dark and driven north through freezing rain. Many did not know where they were going. Some did not have rifles. They arrived in Bastogne on the evening of December 18, just hours before German forces reached the outskirts of the town. They dug in, and the siege began. Within 2 days, the Germans had encircled Bastogne completely. 4 panzer and 2 infantry divisions surrounded the town, over 40,000 German troops against fewer than 12,000 Americans. The 101st Airborne, elements of the 10th Armored Division, and remnants of other scattered units now formed a ragged defensive perimeter roughly 16 miles in circumference. They had no secure supply line. The weather had closed in, thick clouds and snow grounding the cargo planes that might have delivered food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The men scraped shallow foxholes into ground hard as concrete. They had no winter uniforms. They wrapped themselves in parachute silk, blankets scavenged from abandoned houses, anything to keep warm. They burned furniture for heat. They rationed ammunition, counting each bullet. And they waited. On December 22nd, the Germans sent a delegation under a white flag. 4 soldiers approached the American lines carrying a formal surrender demand typed on paper. It was addressed to the USAA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The message was clear and, in the logic of war, reasonable. The German commander pointed out the futility of continued resistance. The Americans were surrounded. They had no hope of relief. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Continued fighting would result only in needless suffering and death. If they surrendered now, the message promised, all personnel would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. If they did not, the town would be annihilated. The deadline was 2 hours. The German envoys were escorted, blindfolded, to a command post in the center of town. There, they waited while the message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. McAuliffe read the ultimatum. He was a man of few words, 53 years old, a career artillery officer who had risen through competence rather than charisma. Those present later recalled that he read the German message, looked up and said one word, "Nuts." His staff laughed. Someone suggested they send that as the official reply. McAuliffe agreed. The typed response delivered to the waiting Germans read simply, "To the German commander, nuts!" The American commander. The German officers were confused. They did not understand the idiom. An American officer explained in plain language. It meant, "Go to hell." The envoys were escorted back to their lines. 2 hours later, the German artillery barrage resumed. That single word, nuts, would echo far beyond Bastogne. It would be printed in newspapers across America and Britain. It would be read aloud in factories and schoolhouses. It would become shorthand for defiance, for a particular kind of American stubbornness that refuses to calculate odds or accept inevitability. But in the frozen foxholes around Bastogne, the word meant something else. It meant another day of fighting, another night of cold, another morning wondering if today would be the day the panzers broke through. The German commanders were incredulous. They had offered honorable surrender. They had expected pragmatism, perhaps even relief from men who surely understood their position was hopeless. Instead, they received mockery. This was not how soldiers were supposed to behave. This was not rational. And yet, it confirmed something the veterans of the Eastern Front had begun to suspect, that the Americans, for reasons unclear, did not fight the way the Wehrmacht understood fighting. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "These paratroopers seem to believe they can win. Even now, surrounded, freezing, they man their positions as if reinforcements are certain. I do not understand it." What the lieutenant could not see, what no amount of reconnaissance or interrogation could reveal, was the texture of belief that sustained the Americans. These men were not fighting for abstract ideology or territorial conquest. They were fighting because they had decided, individually and collectively, that retreat was impossible. Not because of orders, though orders mattered, but because of something deeper. They had been told from the moment they enlisted that they were the best. The 101st Airborne wore the screaming eagle patch with pride. They had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. They had fought through Carentan and Holland. They were paratroopers, an elite within the army, and that identity carried weight. To surrender now would be to betray not just the mission, but themselves. And so they held. But identity alone does not stop tanks. The men needed ammunition. They needed food. They needed medical supplies. By December 23rd, the situation was critical. Surgeons in the makeshift aid stations performed amputations without anesthesia. Wounded men lay on church pews, their blood freezing to the wood. Frontline soldiers were down to 10 rounds per rifle. Machine gunners fired in short, disciplined bursts, making every belt count. The artillery, normally the backbone of American defensive firepower, rationed shells, firing only when targets were certain. And still, the Germans attacked. They came at dawn and dusk, infantry advancing behind tanks, probing for weak points, trying to crack the perimeter. Each attack was beaten back, but at cost. The American line grew thinner. Entire companies were reduced to 30 or 40 effectives. Platoons became squads, squads became fire teams, and still they held. Then, on the morning of December 23rd, the weather changed. The clouds broke. Sunlight, pale winter sunlight, touched the snow for the first time in a week, and with the clear skies came the planes. C-47 cargo aircraft, lumbering and unarmed, flew over Bastogne in formation. Their bellies opened and parachutes blossomed. Red, white, blue, green, hundreds of them drifting down like strange flowers. The men in the foxholes stood and cheered. They waved, they shouted. Some wept. The supplies came down in bundles, ammunition, plasma, bandages, rations. Also chocolate bars, cigarettes, mail from home. The planes kept coming all day, wave after wave, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that strafed German positions on the perimeter. The siege was not lifted, but the Americans were no longer alone. They had been resupplied. They could fight. The German soldiers watching from the tree line understood what this meant. The Americans had not just wealth. They had reach. They had the ability to project power across an ocean, across a continent, through hostile skies, to deliver food and bullets to men trapped in a pocket of snow and ruin. One German officer, observing the airdrop, reportedly said to his men, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a system." He was right, but only partially. The system, the logistics, the industry, the overwhelming material advantage was real. But it was not the whole story. For the system could deliver supplies, but it could not deliver will. It could not deliver the decision, made in 1,000 frozen foxholes, to stay and fight. On Christmas Eve, the Germans launched a major assault. SS Panzer Grenadiers, supported by tanks, struck the northwestern edge of the perimeter near the village of Champs. The attack began with artillery and Nebelwerfer rockets, screaming, terrifying weapons that the Americans called "screaming Mimes." The barrage tore through the thin defenses. Then came the tanks, Tiger IIs and Panthers, their guns traversing, seeking targets. Behind them, German infantry advanced in the snow, shadows moving between trees. The American paratroopers waited. They had bazookas, a handful of anti-tank guns and rifles. They had no illusions about stopping a Tiger II with small arms. But they had learned, through bitter experience, that tanks without infantry support are vulnerable. And so, they let the tanks come close. Then they fired. Bazookas flared. A Panther brewed up, its ammunition cooking off in a fountain of sparks. Another tank threw a track and slewed sideways, blocking the road. The German infantry, caught in the open, were cut down by machine gun fire. The attack stalled. The Germans regrouped and came again. Again they were stopped. By dawn, the snow around Champs was churned and red. The line held. And yet, the question persists: why? Why did these men, cold and hungry, outnumbered and surrounded, choose to fight rather than surrender? The answer, if there is one, lies not in doctrine or orders, but in the particular alchemy of American identity in wartime. These soldiers had grown up during the Great Depression. They had known poverty, uncertainty, the humiliation of breadlines and dust storms. But they had also known something else, the promise, however distant, that life could be better, that hard work and sacrifice might lead to dignity, prosperity, a house with a yard and children who would not go hungry. They had grown up in a democracy, however flawed, where a man's voice mattered, where the government could be criticized, where the future was not fixed. And they had chosen to fight, not because they were compelled, but because they believed, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, that this idea, this experiment, was worth defending. The Germans could not comprehend this. The Wehrmacht was built on obedience, hierarchy, the Führer principle. A soldier fought because he was ordered to fight, because the state demanded it, because to do otherwise was treason. The idea that men might fight hardest when fighting for themselves, for an idea rather than a leader, was foreign. And so, when the Americans refused to surrender at Bastogne, when they held despite all rational calculation, the Germans interpreted it as fanaticism or stupidity. They could not see that it was neither. It was something else. It was belief. On December 26, the siege of Bastogne was broken. The 4th Armored Division, part of General George Patton's Third Army, punched through the German encirclement from the south. The lead tank, a Sherman commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus, rolled into the perimeter at 4,045 in the afternoon. The paratroopers emerged from their foxholes, gaunt and filthy, and shook hands with the tankers. There was no celebration. The fighting continued. The Germans launched counterattacks for days, trying to re-establish the encirclement. But the corridor was open. Supplies flowed in. Reinforcements arrived. The 101st Airborne, having held for 8 days surrounded, now held as part of a larger offensive. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, but Bastogne had become a turning point. The German offensive had stalled. The Allies would push east, across the Rhine, into the heart of the Reich. The war would end in 5 months. In the immediate aftermath, German prisoners were interrogated. Many expressed disbelief that the Americans had held. They had been told the perimeter was cracking, that surrender was imminent. Instead, they had been captured. One young SS trooper, 19 years old, asked his interrogator, "Why did you not surrender? You had no chance." The interrogator, a captain from Brooklyn, thought for a moment and replied, "We didn't see it that way." The German shook his head. "You are either very brave or very stupid." The captain smiled. "Maybe both." But the true measure of Bastogne lies not in the tactical victory, significant as it was, but in what it revealed. It shattered irreversibly the myth of the soft American. German after-action reports from the Ardennes campaign speak in tones of frustration and grudging respect. They describe American soldiers as tenacious, resourceful, willing to fight to the last man. One report, filed by a Wehrmacht intelligence officer, notes, "The American soldier, when well led and supplied, is a formidable opponent. His fighting spirit, previously doubted, has been demonstrated beyond question. He does not collapse under pressure, he adapts." This was not the assessment Germany had wanted. It was not the assessment their doctrine had prepared them for. But it was the truth. And the truth was that the Americans who held Bastogne were ordinary men who had done something extraordinary. They were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, clerks from Philadelphia. They had not been raised to be warriors. They had been raised to be citizens. And when the moment came, when survival depended on sacrifice, they gave it. Not because they loved war, they did not. Not because they hated the enemy, though many did. They fought because they had made a promise, spoken or unspoken, to the men beside them and to the country that had sent them. They fought because, in the arithmetic of democracy, every man counts. And no man wanted to be the one who let the others down. There is a photograph, taken in the days after the siege was lifted, that captures something of this. It shows a group of paratroopers, maybe a dozen, standing in the snow outside a shattered barn. They are smiling, some smoking cigarettes, one holding a captured German helmet. Their uniforms are filthy, their faces are drawn. But their eyes are bright. They look like men who have won a bet with death. In the foreground, one soldier holds a K-ration box. It is a small thing, a cardboard box containing a can of hash, some crackers, a bar of chocolate. To the men in the photograph, it is treasure. It is proof that the system, the vast, impersonal American war machine, has not forgotten them. It is proof that they are not alone. And it is proof, perhaps most importantly, that the abundance they had known in peacetime, the plenty that the Germans believed made them weak, was in fact a source of strength. For abundance meant options. It meant flexibility. It meant that even surrounded and outnumbered, there was a chance. There was always a chance. This is the symbolism that runs through Bastogne like a thread. The supplies dropped from the sky, the rations shared in foxholes, the ammunition that arrived just in time. The American soldier was never just a man with a rifle. He was a man connected to an entire civilization, a civilization that could build a bomber, fly it across an ocean, and deliver a candy bar to a frozen forest in Belgium. The Germans had discipline and courage. They had excellent equipment and experienced officers. But they did not have this. They could not match the logistical miracle of democracy in total war. And at Bastogne, that difference became tangible. It became the thing that allowed 12,000 men to hold against 40,000. But even logistics cannot explain the refusal to surrender. For that, we must return to the American character, to the particular mixture of individualism and collective purpose that the Depression and the New Deal had forged. These men had been told, repeatedly, that their voices mattered, that they were citizens, not subjects, that the government existed to serve them, not the other way around. And so, when General McAuliffe said, "nuts," he was not just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every private in every foxhole who believed, fundamentally, that no foreign power had the right to dictate terms. That surrender was a choice, and they chose otherwise. This was not fanaticism. It was democracy, weaponized. In the years after the war, Bastogne became legend. Books were written, movies were made, veterans returned to the town for reunions, walking the same roads they had defended, now paved and peaceful. The Belgian people, who had sheltered wounded Americans in their cellars and shared their meager food, erected monuments. One, a stone eagle with wings spread, stands on a hill overlooking the town. Inscribed at its base are the words, "Seldom has so few done so much for so many." It is a variation of Churchill's tribute to the RAF pilots of the Battle of Britain, and it is fitting. For Bastogne was, in its way, an American Battle of Britain, a moment when a small force, against all odds, held the line and changed the course of history. The German soldiers who fought at Bastogne, those who survived, carried the memory for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, many spoke of the battle with a kind of haunted respect. They had seen their tanks burn. They had watched their comrades fall in the snow. They had believed victory was certain, and they had been wrong. One former Wehrmacht officer, speaking in the 1970s, said, "We thought the Americans were soft because they had too much. We did not understand that having much makes a man fight harder, not softer. He knows what he will lose." It is a profound observation, and it cuts to the heart of the matter. The American soldier at Bastogne was fighting not just for abstract freedom, but for a specific vision of life, a life with hot coffee and jazz music, with Saturday movies and Sunday dinners, with the right to speak your mind and choose your path. This vision, tangible and personal, was worth the cold and the fear and the risk of death. And so, when the snow finally melted in the spring of 1945, when the last guns fell silent and the survivors went home, Bastogne remained, not just as a town, but as a proof. Proof that the soft Americans were not soft at all. Proof that wealth and democracy, far from weakening a people, could forge them into something resilient and fierce. Proof that free men, fighting for a future they could imagine, were more than a match for soldiers trained to obey without question. The Germans had believed otherwise. They had believed that discipline and hardship created superior warriors, and they had learned, in the frozen forests of Belgium, that they were wrong. Bastogne stands now as a testament to that learning. It stands as a reminder that the measure of a soldier is not found in his ideology or his training, but in the moment when he must choose, surrender or fight, retreat or hold. The men of the 101st Airborne made their choice. They chose to hold. And in doing so, they wrote a chapter in the long story of what free people can achieve when they decide that the future is worth the cost. They were cold. They were hungry. They were surrounded. And they did not break. They held the line, and the line held the world. In the decades since, historians have debated the tactical significance of Bastogne, the decisions made, the opportunities lost or seized. But for the men who were there, the meaning is simpler. They held because they could not imagine doing otherwise. They held because the man to their left and the man to their right were holding. They held because somewhere across the ocean people were counting on them. And they held because, in the end, they were not soft. They had never been soft. They were American soldiers, and they had something the Germans did not. A belief that the world could be better, and that their sacrifice might help make it so. This is the legacy of Bastogne. Not just a military victory, though it was that. Not just a symbol of defiance, though it was that too. But a revelation of what ordinary men, armed with belief and backed by the machinery of a free society, can accomplish when the stakes are highest. The Germans thought they knew the Americans. They thought they had measured them, categorized them, understood their weaknesses. And at Bastogne, in the snow and fire and cold, they learned how wrong they had been. The Americans were not soft. They were something else entirely. They were men who had chosen to be there, who fought not because they had to, but because they believed it mattered. And that belief, tested in the crucible of siege and suffering, proved stronger than all the panzers and all the propaganda the Third Reich could bring to bear. The snow falls still in Bastogne every winter, covering the fields where men once fought. The town is quiet now, prosperous, a place where children play and tourists visit monuments. But the memory remains, carved in stone and carried in the hearts of those who understand what happened there. A small group of soldiers, surrounded and outnumbered, held a line that should have broken. They held it because they were Americans. And they held it because, in the deepest sense, they knew that freedom, once lost, is not easily regained. They knew that the world they loved, imperfect, messy, loud with argument and bright with possibility, was worth defending. Even in the cold, even in the dark, even when surrounded. And so they held. and the world held with them.